Hello, and welcome to Peninsula Peace and Justice Center's very first live online broadcast, coming to you from a couple of places on the planet. My name is Paul George. I'm Director of Peninsula Peace and Justice Center, and I'm glad to see we're collecting a lot of viewers so far. Thank you for joining us. Just a little word before we get started. This is our first time trying this technology. There are bound to be some glitches. I don't expect a perfect broadcast. So if we do come up with a glitch or two here or there, I ask that you be understanding. And if the whole thing crashes, I ask that you be forgiving. Joining us, as you know, is Professor Joel Beinin, the Donald J. McLaughlin Professor of History at Stanford University, where he has been teaching a seminar on the Israel-Palestine conflict for some 25 years or so. He's the author of numerous books on the Middle East and is a past president of the Middle East Studies Association. Joel, welcome to our live broadcast on the internet, and thank you for joining us.
Good morning or good evening, wherever you are, and thank you for having me.
Well, it is 7 o'clock in the morning there in Tel Aviv, where you are. I trust you have gotten sufficient coffee and stuff to join us.
I'm ready to go.
Okay. Let me just explain to our viewers for a moment that Joel is in Tel Aviv on a personal visit. Sadly, he's visiting an old friend who is quite ill, so he hasn't really had the full opportunity to talk to other academics and activists as he would on a normal research visit, although he's had some chance to do that. The point is, we are having Joel on here because of his expertise, not his current proximity to the conflict. We would be having him on this broadcast if he was in Trenton, New Jersey, for example. So, Joel, as we went on, as we first connected, you were telling me there is some breaking news there in Israel and Palestine. That's got to be the place to start. What is the breaking news?
As we are now speaking, Israel's Security Cabinet is meeting to discuss a ceasefire offer, which has been mediated by Egypt, I presume with the support of the United States, since John Kerry has spoken to Egyptian President Sisi about this. Naftali Bennett, the head of the Jewish Home Party, which is a member of the coalition, right-wing to the right of the Likud, has already announced that he will oppose a ceasefire. I presume also that Avigdor Lieberman, the foreign minister, whose party, Israel is Our Home, had been in an alignment with the Likud, broke the alignment early on in this campaign, and he is in favor of a ground invasion, so I presume he will oppose it. The Army High Command, on the other hand, is for it. Hamas, for its side, has said that it is ready for a ceasefire, but it will not accept a ceasefire without a full agreement on terms. And the reason for that is that Hamas says, with considerable justification, that there was a published ceasefire agreement in November of 2012, which was the last similar round between Israel and the Gaza Strip, and Israel then violated the terms of that agreement.
So as I understand it, what is happening now is just a ceasefire, and then they would send representatives apparently to Cairo to actually negotiate the elements of a lasting truce. Is that kind of where we're at?
That's the proposal that's been put before the government of Israel. It's not clear that the Security Cabinet will agree to this, and it's also not clear that Hamas will agree to this.
For people who aren't all that familiar with the structure of the Israeli government, the Security Cabinet is a special kind of sub-cabinet of the larger governmental cabinet. How many people are on it? How many votes do they need? And how concerned are you that they actually aren't going to get the votes for a ceasefire?
I believe there are 7 people, but I'm not positive. It includes the Prime Minister, of course, the Minister of Defense. Both of them are Likud people. It includes Naftali Bennett of the Jewish Home Party as one of the major coalition partners. It includes Avigdor Lieberman, the foreign minister of Israel is Our Home Party. Both of those parties are to the right of the Likud. That's four. I am not sure who the others are.
Okay, and it's probably a little tough to figure the odds on how this vote would go down.
Yeah, the meeting has just begun. Typically, the minute after such a meeting ends, there will be a full leak of everything, but I'm just telling you what has been pre-leaked before the meeting began.
Right, and again, they were just sitting down to this meeting really as we went live online here, is that correct? 7 a.m.?
5 minutes ago.
Yeah. So talk for a minute about the previous truce. There was, as you mentioned, we last saw something like this that's going on now back in 2012, and they went through a similar process of a ceasefire and working out some kind of truce. Talk a bit about what that last truce looked like and what happened to it.
So the terms of the truce were that Hamas would cease firing rockets at Israel and, to the best of its effort, try to prevent organizations like Islamic Jihad, which was not a party to the truce, from doing so. Israel would agree to expand the area that fishermen from Gaza are permitted to use. Right now, they can't go out farther than 3 kilometers, and if they do, Israel shoots at the boats. This is important because there is not enough food in Gaza. The truce agreement also specified that Egypt and Israel would ease up on the passage from Gaza to Egypt to open the Rafah checkpoint, which is the border checkpoint between the Gaza Strip and Egypt. Now, in November of 2012, Mohammed Morsi of the Muslim Brothers was the president of Egypt. And Hamas is essentially the Palestinian branch of the Muslim Brothers. And so Morsi was both quite an appropriate person to mediate a truce and actually somewhat interested, since Hamas was his ally, to promote this idea. Israel, for its part, didn't allow the easing up of the border between the Gaza Strip and Egypt, even though the border doesn't effectively relate to Israel. It's the border between the Gaza Strip and Egypt. Israel has a very substantial degree of control over it, and people can't pass through unless they get an Israeli security clearance. Israel also didn't expand the fishing area. Hamas, for its part, did indeed try, to the best of its ability, which was certainly not perfect, to suppress rocket fire from Islamic Jihad, and now there is an al-Qaeda-linked group which is even more radical in the Gaza Strip. And in fact, the Hamas operative who was killed back in, I think it was June 29th, was one of the people responsible for suppressing the rocket fire of Islamic Jihad, and Hamas protested. Why did you kill this guy? He's collaborating with you, essentially. And
was Israel aware of that? That he was the guy?
Israel has excellent intelligence.
Yeah.
It's frightening what they know. It's very unlikely that they didn't know who they were getting, and so essentially, Israel not only didn't carry out the terms of the November 2012 agreement, but directly violated it by attacking this Hamas operative, who was someone they should have wanted to keep alive.
So, as you mentioned, there has been a big change in governments in Egypt, which was the broker of the last ceasefire and truce and guarantor of the last ceasefire and truce and border access and that sort of thing. And since that time, as we all are painfully aware, Morsi is gone. The military is back in full control of Egypt, and they are no fans of Hamas. They, as you mentioned, Hamas is basically the Palestinian version of the Muslim Brotherhood, who has been hounded into jail, death sentences, and everything else in Egypt. How does that new government in Egypt affect any foregoing truce? It doesn't seem like Hamas would be very trusting of the new Egyptian government.
No, they shouldn't be. In fact, before this was announced late last night or early this morning, the Egyptian media were going berserk and basically cheering on Israel. One of the most prominent TV presenters on an important talk show, Egypt Today, was encouraging Israel to kill every last member of Hamas in the Gaza Strip because they are terrorists and they have violated Egyptian sovereignty and they support the Muslim Brothers. There was a column in Al-Ahram, the major government-owned daily, pretty much to similar effect. So the hardcore pro-Sisi, pro-Mubarak elements who are making a big comeback in Egypt now essentially were egging Israel on and had no problem with what Israel is doing. So I imagine that Secretary of State John Kerry put considerable pressure on Sisi to agree to this. We may recall that right after Sisi was elected in an election that had many, many problems, Kerry was in Cairo 2 weeks later to affirm that the American-Egyptian alliance is going to continue, that military aid is going to be resumed. And I think what that means is that the United States, even if it may be very unhappy with the outrageous level of human rights violations, Egypt today is a far more brutal regime than in the last 10 years of the Mubarak period. But the United States has decided we need them, and this is exactly what we need them for.
Can we expect Egypt to be offering fair terms to Hamas in any kind of truce that they may try to broker? Just before we went on the air, I was searching around for an article, I think it was in Haaretz yesterday, that described the Egyptian proposal for the truce agreements as putting Hamas in a corner. Do you know any of the elements of the proposed truce?
First of all, the word fair is inappropriate for anything that is going on here. If the fighting stopped today, 1.8 million people living in the Gaza Strip are still in a virtual open-air prison with inadequate food and water. Israel has once again bombed important medical facilities. They destroyed a rehabilitation center, killing 2 patients who couldn't be moved. It is utterly and totally outrageous what Israel has already done and may yet do. There are no terms for the ceasefire, which is the problem. The proposal is that at 9 a.m. local time, which will be 11 p.m. California time, the firing stop without any terms. And Hamas's response to that is, we're prepared to stop firing, but what are the terms?
Right. Yes. Why give up? Why stop their position without even knowing what they're agreeing to? Well, we will wait and see. Maybe there will be some breaking news before we're off of here. How long do these cabinet meetings usually take?
It could last for a good hour or two, or it could break up very quickly if it's clear that there's no majority for the truce.
Yeah. Well, let's go back to the situation that we put this program together originally to talk about, and that's what you were just referring to, the absolute tragedy of the past week or so. And I guess my first general question along these lines is this related in some way to the recent failure of the latest round of peace talks, the John Kerry-backed effort to come up with a framework?
In rough terms, yes, but I would first want to emphasize that this is not a tragedy. Tragedy happens when unintentionally bad things occur.
Okay.
This is 100% a war of choice by Israel. It didn't have to happen at all. Israel was deeply upset that the United States essentially recognized the Hamas-Fatah reconciliation government that was formed on June 2nd. The formation of that government and the reconciliation between Hamas and Fatah is the Palestinian response to the failure of the Kerry negotiations. Netanyahu had been saying long before this happened that Hamas is not a partner for peace. He had completely ignored many Hamas statements saying that Hamas is prepared for a 99-year truce with Israel. It's not ready to recognize Israel as the state of the Jewish people, but Fatah isn't either. There was the possibility, if Israel wanted peace, it actually would have been better that there is a Fatah-Hamas joint government, because then Hamas would be responsible for enforcing the peace. If agreement was reached only with Mahmoud Abbas, the president of the Palestinian Authority and the leader of Fatah, then Hamas would be on the outside and would criticize it and would do whatever it would do, and it would have no responsibility for the peace. So if Netanyahu and the Israeli government actually wanted peace, they should have welcomed the unity government and said, okay, now we can negotiate with the representatives of all the Palestinian people. But the cold, clear fact is Netanyahu has never wanted a peace agreement with the Palestinians because he opposes two states.
And I think we just had a confirmation of it, of that very sentiment recently when Netanyahu gave a press conference. I believe it was just yesterday or the day before, and during the question and answer session, he had this to say, and I'm quoting from the Israeli press. Netanyahu is quoted as saying, "I think the Israeli people understand now what I always say, that there cannot be a situation under any agreement in which we relinquish security control of the territory west of the River Jordan." Meaning, as I take that, no withdrawal of Israeli troops, no real two-state solution.
Right. It means that in one form or another, he is demanding that Israeli troops remain stationed in the Jordan Valley. That would effectively totally surround whatever Palestinian entity or entities are created in the West Bank with Israel. So Israel would entirely control entry and exit to this Palestinian entity. They would really unquestionably be South Africa-style Bantustans. Mahmoud Abbas was very clear that he is not accepting that. Even John Kerry, although at first he was prepared to entertained that idea. By the end of his 9-month effort, realized that that is a non-starter. And by repeating that, Netanyahu is knowingly erecting an obstacle to a two-state solution. But realistically, I think it's time to acknowledge that the kind of two-state solution that the international consensus has envisioned since the 1980s, really, is over. It's simply not going to happen.
And so at this point, the status quo of the last several decades is the status quo into the distant future as far as we can see. A continuing Israeli occupation of Palestinian territory, military occupation.
I certainly hope not into the distant future, but for the immediate and middle-range future, this is the policy of the Netanyahu government. Things are fine. They have killed, depending on whose figures you like, somewhere between 178 and 186 people in the Gaza Strip. Close to 80% of them, according to the UN, are civilians, including 19 women and 20-some children.
Yeah.
They're a series of heinous war crimes. Not a single Israeli has been killed during this entire operation. The most serious injury to an Israeli is an 11-year-old Bedouin girl in Laqiya in the Negev, is in critical condition in the hospital as a result of a Hamas rocket. So from the Israeli point of view, this situation is tolerable. As long as they don't send big ground forces into Gaza. There have already been a few small ground raids, but not a major ground invasion. The loss of life, and especially the loss of military lives on the Israeli side, is zero. And killing Palestinians is just something that they do. And if you read Facebook pages and Twitter feeds of Israeli teenagers, I don't like to use this word, but they sound like Nazis. They are, when, for example, the 16-year-old Palestinian boy, Mohammed Abu Khader, was burnt alive after the 3 Israeli teenagers who were kidnapped and murdered were found. There were young Israelis on Facebook and Twitter celebrating that and calling for more. And there have been actual pogroms against Arabs in East Jerusalem. The kind of violent and vicious right-wing nationalist sentiment that has become just common culture here is perfectly fine with killing as many Palestinians as it's possible to kill.
I was just reading this morning an account by a young Israeli who went to a peace demonstration, a peace vigil in downtown Tel Aviv. I guess about 100 people were demonstrating to say stop the killing on both sides, stop targeting civilians, end the occupation, and they were brutally attacked by other Israelis. Part of the problem is in his posting that normally police would be on hand to keep the two sides separated, but in this particular instance, some missiles were spotted in the sky, and all but one of the police officers left to go to a bomb shelter. Is Israeli society pulling itself apart over this? You have been very pessimistic the last couple of times you've been on our TV show about society, and what you just see right now is full of antagonism and racism, basically. What about toward other Israelis, let alone Palestinians?
91% of the Israeli Jewish population, according to a recent poll, supports the way Netanyahu is handling this situation. It is becoming increasingly common that Israeli right-wingers physically attack Israeli Palestinian Arab citizens in East Jerusalem and elsewhere. In the north, where back in 2000, at the time of the outbreak of the Second Intifada, there were many solidarity demonstrations with Palestinians in the West Bank, and 13 Palestinian citizens of Israel were shot dead by the police. None of them were armed. That was a big moment of crisis. In the north, the police have altered their practice, and there have been several demonstrations, both of Palestinian citizens of Israel and joint demonstrations in Haifa and in the triangle town of Tira, which is just on the border of the West Bank, joint Jewish-Arab demonstrations. In those situations, the police have behaved reasonably. They have prevented right-wing crazies from attacking the demonstrators. In Jerusalem, the police are themselves part of the right-wing mob. About 2 months ago, on the day celebrating the so-called unification of Jerusalem, no, that's not 2 months ago, that's 1 month ago, about one and a half months, an American Jew wearing a kippah and a Palestinian keffiyeh and a Palestinian flag came and stood opposite the march and gave an interview and said, "I'm here as an American Jew to declare I do not support my government, that is the government of the United States, policy in supporting Israel. I do not support the occupation. I do not support what Israel is doing to the Palestinian people." And Israeli police beat him up on camera. You can find it on YouTube. An American citizen. Completely unprovoked aggression. So that's the norm for the Jerusalem police, and it's always been the norm for the Jerusalem police back as far as the 1970s when I lived in Jerusalem.
Let's, since you conveniently brought up, because I wanted to make a segue to a slightly different tack on this, the young American who said he didn't support his government's, the American government's position on this whole situation. I'd like to talk about kind of the international diplomatic situation as it stands right now, and in particular, of course, for those of us here in the United States, the role of the U.S. Is pretty clear. We continue to be Israel's largest sponsor, largest funder, and as we saw, John Kerry's recent efforts ended rather abruptly. And there were a couple of events just in the past week that in Israel that I found kind of interesting. First of all, my observation has been that members of the Obama administration have not been out in front of TV cameras as you might have expected in previous administrations, basically cheering on this attack. But more significantly, last week, I believe it was last Tuesday, the Israeli newspaper Haaretz had sponsored, and I imagine this was long in the planning, a conference called Israel Conference on Peace. And the Obama administration's top advisor on Israel-Palestine, Philip Gordon, gave a speech to this conference, and he was pretty bluntly and blatantly critical of the Israeli government. Let me just read one line here. I hope you're familiar with the speech that I'm talking about. Stephen Gordon, top government official, U.S. government official, said, quote, "Israel confronts an undeniable reality. It cannot maintain military control of another people indefinitely. Doing so is not only wrong, but a recipe for resentment and recurring instability. It will embolden extremists on both sides tear at Israel's democratic fabric and feed mutual dehumanization. And following up on that, and I'm going to slaughter the name of this newspaper, and I can't find my note here. Yedioth Ahronoth.
Yes.
Did I get that? Was that close? Okay.
Yeah,
they apparently ran a recent interview with several of, they are unnamed U.S. officials, but they were all involved in the recent failed round of negotiations to achieve some kind of framework. They were very clearly saying in this interview that it was Israel's fault that the talks failed. So are we seeing a distancing of the Obama administration, or are they walking a fine line? What's your read on this sort of thing?
My read is that President Obama and his administration are brazen cowards. They do believe what Gordon said. They do believe that Israel is largely responsible for the failure of the Kerry round of negotiations, but they pretend that they don't understand that the current Israeli government does believe that this situation is indefinitely sustainable and doesn't care that it erodes Israel's democratic character, which anyway, Israel was never really such a hot democracy, and certainly not for Arab citizens, and even all the more so not for Palestinian Arabs living under occupation. For example, in the famous interview with an unnamed source that Ari Shavit did in Haaretz after the talks failed, and then it was assumed that it was with Martin Indyk, who was the one who was managing things for Kerry. Down in the interview, Indyk, assuming it was him, says, "We didn't understand that Netanyahu was using the talks as a way to maintain his coalition." What does that mean? We didn't understand. They don't have experts on what's going on in Israel and in the Palestinian Authority. They don't know who the personalities are. Of course they do. That's completely idiotic. Martin Indyk is many things, but he's not an idiot. So they are pretending that Israel actually does want the solution which the Obama administration does want. I believe the Obama administration wants that solution, but because Israel does not want that solution, they are not prepared either to acknowledge fully that Israel does not want that solution, and certainly not to put any pressure on Israel to achieve that solution, because if any American government decided tomorrow that it was in the national interest of the United States to impose a certain resolution of the conflict here, that would begin to happen. No ifs, ands, or buts.
I want to take a moment to apologize to our viewers. We had asked and given an email address for sending in questions, and my setup here to kind of review emails and while trying to run this online conversation is not working out really well. Some people did send in a few questions before we went on the air, which I was able to print out. And Joel, a number of the questions that came in advance, it all kind of spin around international diplomacy and basically asking the question, well, we understand that the U.S. isn't going to speak out against Israel, but where's the rest of the world? Where's Canada, Britain, and the EU on all this, especially in the midst of this enormous recent outbreak of violence?
Britain, for one, has been even more outrageous than the United States. They have been cheerleaders for Netanyahu and the Israeli government. The EU is not happy. They have expressed their displeasure, but as has been the case always, the EU is not going to get out in front of the United States. So the EU acknowledges that the United States will set the terms for whatever diplomatic processes happen, and they hope and pray that Obama will do something different than what has happened in the past, but there is almost zero likelihood that that will happen. So I would say at the moment, there is almost no possibility that the international community will intervene in a useful way, essentially because the United States is vetoing that. Russia is not concerned enough about this situation to weigh in. China and India certainly don't care enough. So for the moment, the United States has roughly a free hand, which means that Israel has a free hand. That means two things. One, people, ordinary people, have even greater responsibility than ever before to raise our voices and to do what we can do. And in my opinion, the most effective thing that we can do is boycott, divestment, and sanctions. That is what the Palestinian civil society community and the overwhelming majority of Palestinian political activists have called for, and we should support them and be in solidarity with these forms of nonviolent protest. Second, there will eventually be, this is the one thing that I know from my studies as a historian, there will eventually be a change in the regional and global balance of forces. It may be coming even sooner than we think. For example, right now, they are in the final stages of trying to conclude an agreement with Iran. That is the P4+1 on Iranian nuclear enrichment. Now, there are problems about reaching that agreement. The parties are still quite far apart. The deadline is July 20th, but there's an option for them to renew the temporary agreement for another 6 months if they want to. Iran certainly does want to. They've made it very clear that they do want an agreement. If such an agreement is reached, Netanyahu's entire claim that Israel is standing in the front line of Iranian nuclear terror against the entire world will fall apart. The balance of forces in the Middle East will change. Iran will have begun a re-entry process to the international community from which it has been excluded largely by the United States since the revolution of 1979. Now, I'm not predicting, because I don't do predictions, that this is all going to happen, but completely on the side of the Palestine-Israel conflict is a major set of issues, and the United States needs Iran because Iran is the only force that is able to stabilize Iraq. Iran is the most important ally of the current Iraqi government and of the 65% Shia majority of Iraqi people. If the United States wants to deal with that issue seriously, there is no choice but to reintegrate Iran into the international community, and that will mean new ball game for Israel.
I appreciate your explanation of that. I hope people do not underestimate the importance of an agreement between the, I believe it's the P5+1, basically the United States and Iran over the nuclear issue. Critically important, could be a game changer for the entire region, as you just mentioned. We're getting close to the end of the time that we allotted for this, and again, I want to thank you for your time. Let me just say to our viewers at home, I do apologize again about the email problem, but please go ahead and send your questions in. We'll try to get you some answers over the coming days and week or so, because we do want to hear from you. I would like to hear your opinion of the broadcast, but I'll do that right at the end. Joel, before we sign off, I do want to talk about what U.S. activists, the 50-plus people who are tuned into this broadcast right now, may be able to do, and they're not sitting at the negotiating table in Iran, but you did mention BDS, the Boycott, Divestment, and Sanctions Movement. Clearly, this is on the radar screen of Israel and the United States. I think they see it as a potential pressure point on Israel. So I guess basically what I would like to ask you is, where can people find out more information about it and learn how they can get involved in it? And whatever you can say along those lines, is there a particular website that you trust?
So there is an official website for PACB, the Palestinian Academic and Cultural Boycott of Israel. There is an official website for the U.S. National Boycott Committee. The activist organizations like the U.S. Campaign Against the Israeli Occupation and Jewish Voice for Peace have sections of their website devoted to actions and campaigns related to BDS. In the Bay Area, there has been recently a campaign focused on Hewlett-Packard, which makes some of the electronic sensing equipment that Israel uses in the both in the separation barrier in the West Bank and on digitized ID cards. Caterpillar, Raytheon, and a few other major companies are major targets. Different groups have targeted different things. There's a big campaign against SodaStream, which has a factory in the West Bank settlement of Ma'ale Adumim. People will probably remember the infamous Scarlett Johansson commercial during the Super Bowl. She probably did more to make people aware of the BDS campaign than anybody else. So it's not hard to find out what people are doing and where to go to do it. There are regular demonstrations in the Bay Area and around the country at sites where settlement products are being sold. Target stores, for example, sell the SodaStream equipment, so there have been demonstrations there. In Portland, I know, before I came to Tel Aviv, I had moved to Portland for the next 6 months, so that's happening this Saturday, I believe, in Portland. It's not hard to find things. There's lots going on, and in a way, this is a very positive development. I mean, more people know about this issue and more people understand this issue than at any time since I've been engaged in it over the last 45 years.
And I take it you see that as a very positive development. I certainly do. Sunshine does a whole lot of good.
It is the only thing that is going to change things, because the United States government, the EU, the United Nations have all proved themselves impotent or worse. And in the case of the United States, it's an enabler of Israel.
So any closing thoughts before we wrap up this first live online interview?
I think the most important thing that people should take away from the events is that Israel instigated a situation by intentionally provoking hysteria among its people in the wake of the kidnapping and murder of the 3 settler teens in June. A wave of racist sentiment is propelling the air assault on the Gaza Strip. There is absolutely no need for Israel to be doing this. Israel is in no way, shape, or form acting out of self-defense. Even if Hamas fires rockets against civilian targets, which they do, and which is a war crime, and which I do not support, they haven't killed any Israelis. What the Israeli response is outrageously disproportionate and a war crime multiple times over. So the Israeli narrative of self-defense needs to be confronted. Jan Psaki, the spokeswoman of the State Department, was asked by a very brave reporter about a week ago, do the Palestinians in the Gaza Strip have the right to self-defense? And she literally didn't know what he meant. And he tried to ask the question over and to rephrase it, and all she could say, well, there's a difference between terrorism and the State of Israel defending itself. But there's 1.8 million people in the Gaza Strip, the vast majority of whom are civilians. They don't have bomb shelters. They don't have any place to go. 8,000 of them have already been displaced on orders from the Israeli army and have fled the northern Gaza Strip. This is totally outrageous and has nothing to do with the self-defense of the State of Israel.
Our guest has been Joel Beinin, Professor of Middle East History at Stanford University. Joel, thank you so much for taking time out during your trip. I hope the rest of your trip goes well and that your friends are restored to good health. And I just really appreciate you taking the time to be with us and all our viewers this morning. It's still early in the morning there in Israel. Thank you very much.
Thank you for having me.
Okay, and get in touch when you get back, and we'll do some more programs. I want to thank all of you watching there on your computers at home for joining us for this first ever live internet broadcast. And from what I could see, it seemed to go okay. I'd love to have your comments. Email me directly at paul@peaceandjustice.org. I'd love to know what you thought about it. We're pretty excited that we can bring you all kinds of new programs with people from around the globe and do it pretty cheaply. So thanks for joining us. Do keep sending in your questions to the interview question email address that we sent. We will try to get some answers for you, not immediately, but over coming days and weeks. Thanks again for watching, and visit our website, peaceandjustice.org. You might want to sign up for our email list. You might even want to make a donation. Thanks a lot. Good night.